Hey there, welcome back to the Grow Cycle channel. Today we're going to be answering a question that we get asked a lot, and that's how much space do you need to grow mushrooms in? Whether you're looking to grow just a few kilos or pounds a week for your own consumption, or perhaps you're thinking bigger, I'm going to break this down for you and walk through a few different setups to give you the answer to that question. Now, the first thing you need to consider is how much do you actually want to grow? And I always think of it in terms of three different scales of operation. You've got home growing, just for personal consumption. You've got maybe home scale cultivation, but at a slightly bigger scale, so that perhaps you may be going to sell some as a sideline income. And then you've got full scale commercial operations. And we're going to take a look at all three of these scenarios. Let's break it down.
So let's start small then. So if you only want to grow mushrooms for occasional use at home for you and your family, all you need really is just about a square foot of growing space, which isn't much at all. It's about 0.1 of a square meter. And what you'll do with that space is either use a grow kit like this or a fully inoculated, ready to fruit block like this. You want to keep it away from direct sunlight, just on a shelf somewhere. Add a bit of humidity with perhaps a water spray a few times a day, and that will do just fine on a really small scale. Now, if you'd like to go a step on from that and you'd like to start regularly producing mushrooms at home, one option open to you is a Martha grow tent. Essentially, it's just a 4-tier greenhouse modified to grow mushrooms in, so you can automate a few things like fresh oxygen supply and humidity within that growing environment. And a typical size for something like this is about 4 square feet, so that's nearly 0.4 of a square meter. And with a setup like this, if you regularly supply new bags to your growing environment, you'll soon have a steady supply of mushrooms for you, your family and your friends. Now, if you want to get a bit more involved in the whole process, of course, you could go a step back in the process and start to inoculate some wood pellets in, for instance, a bag or a mushroom grow bucket. This would require a little more space temporarily just to hydrate, pasteurize and inoculate your substrate in, but it will only be needed for an hour or so each time you make a batch. You can just use any suitable existing space like your kitchen table or maybe somewhere in the garden for this part of the process, and then you're back to needing just a small amount of space, so 1 to 4 square feet, to house the bags and create the environment for fruiting. So with simple steps like this, you can easily grow 1 to 5 kilograms of mushrooms at home, and that's in the range of 2 to 11 pounds of mushrooms for you to feast on at home.
Moving up the scale a little bit here then, let's consider a scenario where perhaps you want to grow more than just enough for yourself, your friends and family, and maybe you want to sell some as a sideline income. This kind of scale of production can usually be done using space that maybe isn't currently in use in your home. However, you can obviously do it in other spaces as well. The exact amount of space that you need will depend a lot on the production method that you choose, the species that you're growing, how long you leave the bags in the fruiting room for, how many cycles and crops you look to get from each bag. So there's a bunch of different factors here. But I'm going to walk through a scenario where, let's say you're looking to grow 25 kilograms of mushrooms a week. That's around about 55 pounds. And let's assume, for the sake of this, that you're going to be doing this on pasteurized substrate. So you're going to be growing perhaps mainly oyster mushrooms on sawdust pellets or on straw, so you don't need a lab. So let's have a little look at the breakdown of the amount of space that you need here. So for substrate preparation and inoculation, you're going to want around about 10 meters squared. You need enough room to move around in, have your materials stacked up to bag them and things like that. Incubation room. Incubation can be quite tight. That only needs around about 2 meters squared, and for the fruiting space around about 4 meters squared. So in total you're looking at around about 16 meters squared, which is about 170 square feet. Now if you decided you wanted to grow a wider range of species and employ sterile production methods, then you're going to need to add on another 5 to 10 meters squared in space in order to have a lab, which would have a laminar flow hood in, maybe somewhere to have a pasteurizer unit or pressure cookers. You'll need a bit of extra space for that. Now this kind of setup, as I said before, this can work well in your home. It could be in a spare room, for example, perhaps in a shed, a basement, or somewhere out in your back garden that you might want to create a new space for. It's not a huge amount of footprint that we're looking for. You can see here how much you can grow in just a very small space. This is just one rack of shelving, and yet we can grow a large amount of mushrooms in that space. This is one of the great things about growing mushrooms. You can grow a lot in a relatively small amount of space. You can adapt different spaces that you've got to meet the needs of each of the growing stages. And for the fruiting stage, which is generally the more complicated part to create the right conditions for, you could use something like a hydroponics tent, for example, which we used to grow in a few years ago. And I think they're a great way to get started if you're on a low budget, or perhaps if you're in a temporary setup and you want to be able to take it down and move it somewhere else at another point in time, hydroponics tent is a great way to go. You can also adapt various other things, plastic sheeting. You can build grow rooms like the one that we've got here as well, out of cold store panels. So lots of different options of the way you can build your space, but I think starting small, doing it at home, keeps your overheads low. It can be a great way to get started if you want to start selling some mushrooms. One more thing to add, you could consider, if you really don't have much space at all and you want to maximize what you can grow in it, you could consider just doing the fruiting stage only and just buying in ready to fruit substrate blocks that are going to come to you ready to fruit, so you're only managing the fruiting space. That way you're going to be able to produce the highest number of mushrooms in whatever surface area you've got in which to grow.
And I know it's stating the obvious, but if you want to grow on a commercial scale, on a larger scale, you clearly need more space as well. For a lot of people that would be, for instance, an industrial unit rented, like the one I'm stood in right here. For other people it could be a converted barn, or it could be that they use their garages, and all of this keeps your overhead low, of course. Now, in terms of what kind of fruiting space to build, we've built this fruiting room behind me out of cold store panels, which is a great option, but you can also go for a larger hydroponics tent, of course. And besides those two options, what you often see is people growing in shipping containers. That's what we used to do, and they're perfect for growing mushrooms in. Right, so let's get into the specifics a bit more and look at a scenario in which we grow 100 kilograms of mushrooms each week. So that's about 220 pounds of mushrooms. And what you'll be using is a sterile lab and an atmospheric steam sterilizer, so that you can grow a wider range of varieties like a lion's mane, Pio Pinot, and reishi, for instance. So in that scenario, your minimum space requirements would be, for the substrate preparation, about 10 square meters. For your inoculation lab, again, another 10 square meters. For your incubation room, probably between 5 and 8 square meters. For your fruiting room, between 10 and 15 square meters. And then for your dedicated packing and walk-in fridge, round about another 10 square meters, which brings the total to about 45 to 50 square meters, which is approximately 500 square feet. So a quick word of caution then with all these space requirements. It does depend very much on which type of mushroom you want to be growing, and especially shiitake with a really long incubation time of 8 to 12 weeks. That has a massive impact on your required incubation space, of course. So if you want to grow just that variety, do take that into account, or just grow a mix of different varieties that suit your space. So I hope you found those figures in particular very useful, but I also want to mention that this kind of setup, although it requires more investment, it can also be very rewarding. You can easily yield hundreds, if not thousands of pounds or kilograms of mushrooms from a setup like this.
So as you've seen here, you can grow mushrooms in all sorts of different space, everything from just a square foot for your own personal consumption up to hundreds, perhaps thousands of square feet for a more commercial operation like this. And we want to answer more questions like this, so do drop them in the comments below. Any common questions that you may have about either starting, or perhaps you're already growing and you've got questions. We're going to be doing a series now over the coming months answering these sorts of common questions that people often have with regards to mushroom growing. So if you've got any thoughts on that, drop them in the comments there below. And whilst you're at it, if you've enjoyed this video here today, consider giving us a thumbs up and perhaps subscribing to the channel for more videos like this in the future. Thanks a lot for joining us today. We'll see you in the next one.